All right, example one. A Limited purchased a plant from the UK for £100,000. It was shipped FOB on the 15th of January 2010 and invoiced on the 31st of January. All right, so the plant should be recorded at the spot rate on the 15th of January, the transaction date, because that is the date that the risks and rewards were transferred to A Limited. Because FOB means the seller is free of any risks when the goods are on the ship. All right, so we will convert it at that spot rate on the 15th of January. All right. The journal we will process for the acquisition of the plant, assuming that the exchange rate is 13 Rand 72 for each pound on the 15th of January, is the following. So remember, we can also say 1 pound is 13 Rand 72. It's exactly the same. 13.72 is equal to 1 pound, or 1 pound is 13.72. So we take the rate times the foreign currency, that was £100,000, and we debit the asset and we credit the creditor. All right, we owe the money and we have an asset in the books. Right, please remember that this 1372 never changes, because now we have an asset in the books. We will use that cost of the asset to calculate depreciation and impairments and whatever the case may be with regards to our PPE. So that cost of the asset, 1372, will never change. It's exactly the same as what we had in these two examples. That asset cost will never change, because that is the cost of the asset, and we will use that to calculate depreciation. And that will, if it was inventory, then that will be the cost of our inventory. And the same applies for this one. All these costs that we have for the assets remain as it is. All right, so the creditor is payable on the 30th of April. An amount in rands needed to settle the creditor will depend on the spot rate on the date of payment. So if the spot rate is 13 Rand 85, then we will need 1,385,000 to settle the creditor on that date. On the other hand, if the spot rate is only 1360, so you can see there are two possible rates here. It's just for example purposes, 1385, or we can have 1360. So that means there are two different rates. Okay, not two different rates for the same thing. It just means that we can have a higher rate or a lower rate. It's just to explain the question. Then we will only need 1360 to settle this debt. If the rate is higher, originally we used 1372. If the rate is higher, can you see we owe more? All right, because now we owe 1385 and the amount in the books is 1372. If the rate is lower, 1360, then we will only have to pay 1360, which is less. So if we have to pay less, then it is a foreign exchange profit. If we have to pay more, we owe more, the payment is more, then it will be a foreign exchange loss. All right. So the difference between the initial liability amount, let's do something else, and the settlement of the liability will be the foreign exchange profit or loss. So if we assume now that the rate will be 13 Rand 60, It's a lower rate, so we will pay less. So credit the bank with the payment amount, £100,000 times 13 Rand 60, and that gives us the 1360 that will go to the bank. So if we credit the bank with 1360, our creditor should be 0 now, because in the creditor, on the transaction date, we had 1372 as a credit to the creditor. If you go to the first journal, we credit the creditor with 1372. So if we make a payment now and the creditor is settled, what should be the balance on the creditor? The balance after the payment should be 0. How do we get our creditor to be 0? We must say debit the creditor with the bank amount and 1372. And now our creditor is 0. So that is the 1372 that we have there. But the debit side is more now than the credit side, because our bank amount is only 1360. So the difference between the two will be a foreign exchange profit. All right, why is it a profit? Because the rate is lower than at the transaction date. And now we have a profit. All right. So if there is a possible year end in between, then we have to do what? On year end, we have to restate the present. So if there's a year end, we restate what we owe on year end at the spot rate on year end. All right. So the closing rate is used for that. So we restate everything that we might owe on year end for reporting purposes. So if the year end exchange rate is 13 Rand 80, the transaction rate was 1372. The year end rate is 13 Rand 80. So there is an increase in the rate. So that means we will owe more. So that implies the creditor should be credited on year end when we restate it. So the difference is 8,000. So we credit the creditor with 8 and we debit the foreign exchange loss with 8. So now the creditor is reflected as 1380, and that is the year end balance, taking the amount that we still owe on year end at the spot rate on year end. So that's the best estimate to show in your financial statements about the amount payable on year end by using the closing rate of the actual year end date. So if we look at the debtor, after creditor, we will have transaction 1372. We have a loss of 8,000. And that gives us the balance of 1380. All right. So remember, the 1372, the converted foreign currency at the transaction date spot rate is already there. So all we need to do is calculate the difference. All right. So we need to calculate the difference, and that is our adjustment that we need to make. So that 8,000 to 1. That creditor 8,000 is the calculation that we did by using the difference, and we credit the creditor. So what do we have in the books on year end? On year end, we would have an asset of 1372 because the asset originally we put into the books debit property, plant and equipment 1372. All right, just remember there's two parts of this one. We have the original transaction, and then there was a payment before year end. But then the question goes on to say, if we didn't pay before year end, then we would have to restate on year end. And that's where we are now. All right, then we have amount payable, current liabilities, 1380, because that is the restated value of the creditor. All right, and then property, plant and equipment is only at the transaction date, right? That doesn't change. For instance, in this question, we would have had now depreciation, because remember, we will combine foreign exchange and property, plant and equipment as one question to have it in as a combination questions. Operating cost, that 8,000 is in the statement of comprehensive income, and that is our foreign exchange loss. Because we owed more on year end, we had to credit the creditor and we debit foreign exchange loss. And then we have to disclose in the financial statements and the profit before tax note any foreign exchange differences. So under expenses, you would show foreign exchange difference of 8,000. All right, for foreign obligations, then you would say we didn't enter into any forward exchange contracts. On year end, we still owed £100,000. The creditor of 1380 at an exchange rate of 1380 was recorded at year end. All right, so now we had our year end. So on year end, the creditor is in the books of 1380. Remember, it's a balance sheet item. So that closing balance of 1380 is our opening balance, and it's brought forward to the next financial year as 1380. All right. So if we now have a payment subsequent to year end, after year end, we make a payment. All right. The payment is £100,000 times the spot rate of 1385 on the payment date. They give us the rate. We convert our amount that we need to pay, £100,000 at the spot rate. So we will credit the bank with 1380. On year end, our creditor is 1380. So now if we pay that creditor, we shouldn't owe anything. So the balance on the creditor after the payment is 0. So what do? We just debit the creditor with 1380. So now our creditor is 0. And because we paid more than what the creditor balance was, we would have a foreign exchange loss of 5,000. And where does this loss come from? The year-end rate was 1380. The payment rate was 1385. So there was an increase in the rate. And if we have an increase in the rate, that means we owe more. And if we owe more, then we would have a foreign exchange loss. All right. So the total foreign exchange for this transaction is basically 13,000, of which 5,000 is in the current year and 8,000 is in the previous financial statements. There is another method to first restate the creditor on the payment date and then do the bank transaction, but that is just a duplication of all the information. So the easiest to do is to say, what was my creditor on year end or the previous balance that we had? And if it now needs to be zero, we make it zero by taking out that amount. So we debit the creditor. We credit the bank with the bank amount, and the difference between the two will be either a foreign exchange profit or loss. All right, remember, if we have a rate that is lower, then we will pay less, then there will be a foreign exchange profit, and we have to credit foreign exchange profit. If the rate is higher, then we owe more, we're going to pay more, then it's a foreign exchange loss, and we have to debit the foreign exchange loss. All right, and that was example 1 of uncovered transactions for foreign exchange.